Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here are your co-hosts, Doug Lesmerises and Shehan Jeyarajah. And we're back. It's here. The college football playoff has been announced. Doug Lesmerises and Shehan Jeyarajah. Shehan, we're recording about 10 or 15 minutes after the official selection on Sunday afternoon. And we want to keep this raw. That's how we do it. The unvarnished, right? I mean, we're not here because we're professionals. We're here because of our passion. But you said the one thing you said, the only conversation you and I had before we started recording on this Sunday afternoon is you said they got it right. This playoff, Georgia 1, Michigan 2, TCU 3, Ohio State 4. How certain are you that they got it right, and how worried were you that they wouldn't?
Well, you guys heard me on last week's show, right? You guys heard Zombie Shehan. Every single time that Ohio State has had an opportunity to get better than they deserve, they've gotten it. And every time that TCU has had an opportunity to get worse than they deserved, they've gotten it. And so not only did I think that they picked the right four teams, because I do think that these are the right four teams, they're the only one-loss teams in America right now, I think, overall. And so I think that makes it a very easy decision. Obviously, Alabama and Ohio State did not make conference championship games. They only had 12 data points. The other three teams had 13, even though they lost games. And so for me, once USC lost that game, I felt like TCU was all but locked into that number 3 spot. And for them to come out and for the graphic to flip and TCU be in what I think was the right position, and Ohio State, I think, to be in the right position, and obviously Georgia and Michigan, I think, being in the right position, I think it feels good. You know, for all of the hate that they get, for all of the comments, I do think that the committee has more often than not gotten it right at the end. Their path to get there has sometimes been bizarre. Look at TCU starting at number 7 as an undefeated team earlier this year. But once the final graphic went up, I think they found out the right 4, and I'm excited for what should be a really good playoff.
So I can remember in 2017, Ohio State let media members into the team room on that day because we were anticipating interviews soon after the selection. And I thought Ohio State was going to make it in 2017. And as the Big Ten champ, a 2-loss Big Ten champ, it was Ohio State versus an Alabama team that had been number 1 pretty much all year and had lost to Auburn in the final regular season game and did not make the SEC title game. And I can remember watching that come up and flip right on that day and feeling the surprise. I was surprised that they went that way, right? So you have that moment in you, and it's not because I cover Ohio State. It's because I know that the committee can surprise me. So there's two things here. We're going to get back to TCU. We're going to get back to TCU because we need to make sure we give TCU the credit. TCU's in the playoff.
Yes.
TCU, like, there is so much full circle stuff here that is happening. One is I think there's some full circle stuff that I have often talked about. The last time there was a gigantic, 2016 Ohio State Michigan was big, but the biggest Ohio State Michigan game ever, 2006 1 versus 2. The Big Ten is on top. Ohio State wins that game. They're both very competitive. Ohio State goes and loses to an SEC team in the national championship game, and thus begins the rise of the SEC and the fading of the Big Ten. I feel like this is circling back a little bit. For the Big Ten to get 2 teams in is a really big deal. So I think there's a little bit full circle to 2006, which we can talk about for the next month. The idea that the very first playoff was TCU being the 3 seed in the penultimate rankings and then winning its last game in the regular season and then not making it, we are now back full circle. That this is TCU, Shehan. This could be Texas Tech. This could be Oklahoma State. This could be Kansas State. The sort of underdog Big 12 team, right? That fights and fights all year. Fights. That's great. But that it's TCU is better. But we got to say that. We got to save the full circle because we have to talk about the Nick Saban media parade of Nick Saban is hey, it's like Nick Saban. He comes out, right? He's ready to roll in 2 situations. One is Aflac commercial. You got a duck? You want me to talk to a duck for money? Let's do it. I will do anything. You want me to ride the duck? You want me to wear the duck as a hat? And that's fine. I would do anything for a commercial too if they gave me money. Aflac commercial, Nick Saban. You can get Nick Saban to do anything in an Aflac commercial. If Nick Saban was hey, duck, you said that I should dress up as a clown. And the duck's And then it'd be like, oh, Nick Saban's wearing a clown suit for Aflac money. That's fine. I don't have anything wrong. You would do it. Would you do anything for Aflac money? Aflac, throw some Aflac money at Shehan. He'll do literally anything, just like the greatest college football coach of all time will do literally anything. Would you do anything for Aflac money?
I mean, look, if they're paying Nick Saban an amount of money to where he pretends that he and Deion Sanders don't have beef, like, they must be throwing some money around. Nick Saban is signed to a $100 million contract. So yeah, I probably would do pretty much anything for Aflac money.
It blows my mind when really super rich people do commercials, when like George Clooney does like a coffee commercial. I'm like, what is the coffee commercial money that they're throwing at you? You're George Clooney. You own a lake in Italy. You need the coffee commercial money. So that's one time that Nick Saban the Aflac commercial, he'll do anything. And the other thing is, I don't think my team's going to make the playoff, but I want them to. We could have had him on. If we had a show on Saturday night, Shehan, I think we could have had Nick Saban on the College Football Survivor Show, because he'll talk to anybody. But this debate, I'm going to put it in air quotes. This is the air quotiest air quotes you ever air quoted in your life. The air quotes debate about Alabama making the playoff this year, I think existed only in the PR campaign of Nick Saban and anybody who was willing to give him the opportunity to present that PR campaign. I don't think it was ever a real thing, but it made for some politicking and some, reasonably decent TV at halftime of games on Saturday. How real did you ever think Alabama getting in was?
I never thought it was real, right? I never thought that it was a real consideration, because even when you watched Nick Saban go on television, and I talked about this on Twitter a little bit, his case was so bad. That's the thing that got me about it. It wasn't looking at numbers. It wasn't looking at stats. It wasn't trying to give some further context about what this team is and what this team faced or any of that kind of stuff. It was literally what Twitter bots tweet at me all day, right? That Alabama would be favored, and by Twitter bots I mean, of course, Ari Wasserman, but I think that it's the worst case, because he basically went on TV and was like, well, we'd be Vegas favorites. Well, hey Nick Saban, you played 5 games against teams with a winning record in the Power 5, and you went 1-4 against the spread and were outscored by 49 points against the spread. So maybe Vegas just likes taking our money because we think that Alabama's probably good, right? It's a bad way. We talk about Vegas like there's some impartial arbiter of program quality, when no, they're setting lines that are made to take as much money as possible. It's a ridiculous way to look at the sport. And also, by the way, again, Alabama's best win was a 1-point miracle win against Texas by 1 point. And that was their best win. That was their best win of the entire year. They played 2 teams ranked in the top 15 and lost both of them. So the case was never there. And the fact that for Nick Saban, I mean, look, I get it. You're Alabama, you want to make your case, but it feels like a situation where Alabama just kind of should just hold the L and move on with their day, right? In 2019, they never tried to make the case that oh, well, even though we lost to LSU, who by the way is maybe the greatest team of all time, that actually means that we should be in anyway because we lost to LSU, and that's not that bad, right? They never did that. They were just all right, look, it didn't happen this year. We're going to move on with our day and prepare for next year and be even better. And it blows my mind that was not a consideration for the greatest coach of all time, but just look at next year and try to be a better football team.
Well, I do think I'd never have a problem with anybody making the case for their own situation, because if you're not going to look out for number one, nobody else is going to either. So he has 105 guys on that team who have been sacrificing their brains and bodies for months, and he wants the best possible outcome for them. But it's like spin room stuff after a debate, like a political debate. It's spin room. And so the thing that I don't like is you got to go into the spin room understanding that it's the spin room. And so some of the stuff, and I get it, it's all a TV show, but presenting it, anybody who took in the thing, anybody and fans can be fans. Fans can be fans. There were some fans it's not, we're not going to act like Alabama fans can be the only jackhole fans in the world. Every fan base has individuals who are capable of being jackholes. But the Alabama jackholes came out on Saturday night on Twitter and were jackholing all over the place. And again, that is not a broad brush of the, any large swath of Alabama fans. We understand that. But if you took in what was politicking, which is fine, but if you as an unbiased arbiter of college football took in the politicking and went, I don't know, I think he has a case, hang it up, man. Like, what are you doing? Like, that's the thing what world are you living in? Because if in that world, then it's like, well, let's just reserve a spot in the playoff for the team with the highest recruiting ranking. Let's just reserve that spot. What are we doing? It's not. And even the idea, and they started, and I do think there are things when Reese Davis on the ESPN show is tasked with being the first media member to interrogate Boo Corrigan each week before they have a conference call for the rest of the media, because ESPN pays for that right. And I do think Reese Davis does a good job of interrogating him, considering it's like we're paying. He does not softball it, and he comes at it from every angle. And he often asks questions that I completely disagree with the premise of the question. But I always say, you don't just ask questions you believe in. You ask every possible question to poke and prod and get an answer out of a guy. So even Reese was saying like, well, why is TCU ahead of Ohio State? If they were going to play each other, Ohio State would be favored, right? Wouldn't they be favored by Vegas in a head-to-head matchup? Doesn't that mean Ohio State should be number 3? And Boo Corrigan was like, what are you talking about? Like, that doesn't matter, which is good for Reese for asking, but also Boo Corrigan, all this Vegas stuff. Boo Corrigan, as the face of the committee, was kind of like, what? He did what we're doing right now, to their credit, which is, I don't care about Vegas.
Which, by the way, I loved that Reese asked that question, because remember, I was in the mock selection committee this year, and I was there with Boo Corrigan, who is a very nice man who I kind of realized at the time probably is not going to have a very fun time public speaking on television because he's just not necessarily got the temperament for it. But again, very nice man, very thoughtful man. This is, but Ari Wasserman basically asked this question in the committee room, and Boo Corrigan looked at him like he had two heads. Like he basically looked at him like, no, we're not looking at Vegas odds to figure out whether we should put a team into the college football playoff. We're watching football games and seeing what happens during the football games, because that's what you do in sports. Like, I am a huge proponent of analytics. I think they can tell you a whole lot. I like these advanced rating systems. I think that they're valuable. I think that they're a valuable tool to help figure this stuff out, right? I mean, in college basketball, we've kind of reached a point where KenPom is like part of the way that you look at college basketball. But like, what it doesn't do is say, well, like maybe, whoever won the title, I can't even remember who won the basketball title last year, but somebody won the title. But like, when you really look at it, Gonzaga was number 1 in KenPom. So like, I think that this was a mistake to let somebody else win the title. Nobody would do that in any other sport. It's kind of ridiculous that we've reached a point where predictive metrics are supposed to be like definitive metrics, that they're supposed to say this is what these teams are, when again, we had this conversation a little bit before. Ohio State rates at the top or second in the country in all these metrics, and would be big favorites against Michigan. And also they played Michigan at their own house and got curb stomped. So like, at some point that has to matter, that they actually played the football game. And I'm glad that the people in the committee room seem to agree with that logic.
There is a really good Twitter account called BCS Know-How, and I think they have a website at bcsknowhow.com where they simulate all the rankings that were part of the BCS back in the day, when there were 6 computer rankings they accounted for 1/3 of the BCS. The coaches poll accounted for 1/3 of the BCS. And then the AP didn't want to be part of it. So they came up with this Harris poll that was kind of like the AP poll, which was outside media people. And that was 1/3 of the BCS. So the Harris poll doesn't exist anymore, but they just take the AP. And so all the data is still there to do the BCS stuff, right? And so they do this every year. And they have made the point, and it happened again this year. every year of the playoff, the 4 teams that the BCS would have picked are the 4 teams that the playoff committee picked. But I do think like this is a situation, right? And so to BCS know-how, if you go to that Twitter account, they said there's one computer model that is not out yet, but they said that's only like 6% of the input. So they feel pretty good about this. The BCS order would have been Georgia 1, Michigan 2, Ohio State 3, TCU 4. So there's a different, right, 3, 4, but an Alabama 5, which is where Alabama was. This would have been one of those scenarios, Shehan, where part of the problem with that BCS formula is that nobody was inside the computer formulas. You didn't know exactly necessarily what was going into the algorithms. And one thing that people brought up is you did not know if somebody made an input error. So somebody could have, it was like, it's just a person who started off doing it for fun and then was good at it. But nobody's ever paying them. And it's like, oh, my teenager helped me input something and they put TCU, instead of putting TCU 3, they put TCU 103 and nobody double checked it. And TCU, you know what I mean? Like that. So we had to get away from that. But that is why I think you need humans. It would have made me nervous, Shehan, if we were in a BCS world, if we were in a computer and voters who don't talk to each other world, where Bama would have gotten in. Just like raw data, there's enough lingering stuff from preseason. If somehow there's there's a strength of something, which might not be much more than strength of reputation, right? There's an SOR that's like strength of record. Maybe this should be a SO rep, strength of reputation. That should not matter, but I think can leak in. In a world where there weren't 13 people talking to each other, I would have been more worried, Shehan, about Alabama sneaking in with 2 losses as a non-champ ahead of TCU or Ohio State on this Sunday. So in the end, we're 9 for 9 on the BCS, and the committee would arrive at the same thing. But I'm very happy it was people talking because they could all sit there. And I think most people know by now, on selection weekend, they come early and they watch all the conference championship games together. And then they talk, then they watch, then they talk, then they watch, then they talk, then they talk, then they talk, then they decide. So guess what they watch together? They watch Nick Saban politicking together. And they could look at each other and be like, yeah, this guy. We love this guy. You ever see those duck commercials? He's so good in those. But we're not listening to him here. But I do think we needed people here because I would have had a knot in my stomach of, is there a backdoor way for Bama? Because the numbers would reflect that. And there's another point I want to make. But I was happy. I'm pro people generally, people versus robots, people versus algorithms. And listen, honestly, I don't like people that much. I'm just that anti-robots. So this was a good people day. Even though we got to the same place, I'm glad it was those 13 people.
Yeah, I watched, I know it took me a while. I watched The Matrix this past summer for the first time. And now I will say it did make me laugh a little bit that at the end, they're just kind of like, all right, we made some giant philosophical case. Let's just give Keanu Reeves guns now. And that's just how the movie ends. That made me chuckle a little bit.
I still haven't seen it. Now you ruined it for me. I still haven't seen it.
You haven't seen The Matrix?
Don't they wear long coats and sunglasses? That's part of it, right?
It is part of it. It is part of it. But
I do like Lawrence Fishburne. I like Lawrence Fishburne. I'm not huge on Keanu. Yeah. All right. I'll watch it.
Yeah. You should watch it. I just assumed. I mean, you would have been up and active during that period. I had to go back because I was a kid then, but okay. That's interesting. But anyway, point is, when we trusted the robots, it didn't go so hot. And I think that ultimately there are things that I will never fully love about this process, right? I think that part of it is just ultimately the people in the room and trying to pick the right collection of people to be in that room. But in terms of the actual process of deciding, I mean, this is how I think it should work, right? You have people who have been around football, you have people who watch games, you have people who have access to data, but no one of those factors takes precedence over the other. All of them are taken under consideration. I think that's how it should be. I have data people who I respect a lot who say, no, data should be an even bigger part of this process. And I understand their perspective. And I have other people who say, well, look, I saw that player run fast and this guy block hard, and therefore we should ignore what happened on the football field. And I don't agree with that either, right? So I think the fact that we've reached sort of a happy medium between all of those things is ultimately a good place to be at. Now, I will say, too, I'm excited for a level of objectivity of, hey, you won your conference. That matters. I think that taking that and throwing it into the process is only going to make everything better from a selection criteria perspective. But I think, again, there's always going to be a little part of me that's zombified because of 2014, but I do think that that we have seen this process continue to get better and more transparent and more understandable as now we go through this is the 9th version, right, of the playoff, and I think generally speaking, out of the 36 teams that they've chosen for this, more than 30 I've had zero issue with, right? And then there's maybe a couple at the end that you can quibble with, but that's a pretty good place to be versus, how bad this potentially could have been.
So this is your zombie shot, right? Don't they do? I don't watch The Walking Dead either, but isn't there a shot to unzombie somebody? There's probably a shot,
really?
Right?
Oh, that's crazy.
Just a shot. Like, this guy's a zombie. Hey, this guy's a zombie. It's like, get the zombie shot. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure the scientists are working on an anti-zombie shot. Is
it like a gunshot, or is it like a vaccine shot, or is it like a drink shot?
Oh, no, that'd be better if it was a drink shot. Oh, no, my daughter hates shots. So now I'm going to say, I wish my daughter, instead of taking shots, could just take a shot. Like, hey, 15-year-old, I know you don't like needles. Here's a shot glass. Drink this.
See, when you said that, I was like, wait, your daughter hates shots? I don't think she's 21, is it? Do you just take shots at home?
I'm a terrible parent. I'm a terrible parent. No, I'm not feeding alcohol to my teenagers. They don't like needles, though. Okay, so let's finish this. Because number 5 matters. Alabama's number 5. Alabama, in the end, had opportunities in its hands to not be number 5. And the idea, I do think that I thought the Tennessee loss, right, that version of Tennessee at Tennessee, the way that game went, that's a good loss. The team that LSU is, I don't know that there's any version of losing to LSU, no matter how close it is, that you could say, it's like, LSU, man, they lost to Texas A&M, and then it was like, I don't know, they hung around with Georgia a tiny bit, but like, that is not a good team. Like, they're fine. They're better than we thought they were at the beginning of the year. In the end, as we finish Alabama before we move on, is anybody at Bama really going to be mad? Or is even Saban like taking off his jacket and be like, well, I did everything I could. I knew it wasn't going to work, but I had to try. Oh, well, let's go play in the Sugar Bowl. Like that. Nobody at Bama can actually, as a 2-loss non-champ, you love your team and you should love your team. But as soon as you step back from the moment and it's over, you get it. Don't you? Is there any lingering, they got it wrong, we feel this was unjust case that Bama fans can hang on to?
Yeah, I think that there will be people in that room who say, but we would beat TCU. And obviously that's not really based on anything other than assuming what TCU is and what you are, right? Like it's probably not actually valid, but there will be people who will say that, but I don't think there's anybody who can look at the process and look at how teams are selected for the college football playoff and say, based on the criteria they set forth, it would make more sense for us to be in the playoff than Ohio State or TCU. I don't think that anybody in the room can seriously believe that, even if they think that they are a better team or could win the national title or could beat Texas by 2 points.
All right, quick break on the College Football Survivor Show. When we come back, avoiding an Ohio State-Michigan rematch, what we think of that. We got to give more credit to TCU and what we think about this team. We have to talk about other teams that blew other opportunities to make Sunday much more interesting. And I do want to talk about a little bit of what a 12-team playoff would have looked like this year. We'll do it next after this.
Don't miss the College Football Survivor Show bonus episode this week. Available only on Apple Podcasts.
I actually thought there's more upside with less baggage to Lane Kiffin, because I do think there's a cap on Hugh Freeze. I don't know that we've seen the best of Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin's like a child star. He's like Corey Feldman, right? It's like we've seen him grow up as a coach in front of our eyes the whole time. And then it's like he kind of fell off the scene, and then he was like had this guest arc on an ABC sitcom for like 6 episodes. And you're like, I don't know, is this guy a pretty good actor now? You know, he was in like got a supporting role in an indie film and got a surprise Oscar nomination. And so then it's like, I don't know, should we hire him to be in a Marvel movie now? And some people are like, it's Lane Kiffin. Remember when he was that obnoxious guy in the baseball movie when he was 13? And it's like, yeah, I don't know, but isn't he kind of a good actor? I feel like that's where we are with Lane Kiffin. And then he had like a goofy week on Twitter. I think he's like a better football hire for Auburn than Hugh Freeze is. So I don't know what's going to be next with Lane Kiffin, but I hope he's in a movie.
I love that the first child star you thought of was Corey Feldman.
Corey Feldman's like 65 now. I know. I'm sorry.
He's 51. I had to be reminded who Corey Feldman was because this might be a shocker. I do not remember him as a child star since I was born in 1994.
Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts for exclusive College Survivor Show bonus episodes.
All right, Doug and Shehan back. TCU, and let's go back to the Horned Frogs here because this is a remarkable story, and we're probably not going to give a lot of attention to Georgia and Michigan right now because they're so good. Now I'm going to detour again. This is one point I want to make real quick. We have a 4-team playoff. We have I would almost be in favor of this. Like the playoff every year is every team that meets a threshold, that meets a deserves to be in the playoff threshold, because people use that word deserve. But you're doing it in a world where you're setting the numbers first and then having a deserve argument. And the context constantly changes every year. So the deserve argument of like, this team doesn't deserve to get in. It's like, well, who would you put in? There might not be 4, quote, deserving teams this year. And the deserve argument is mostly made by middle-aged men about 20-year-old football players and how disgusted they are. I can't believe I have to watch this team that doesn't deserve. It's like, just be quiet. I don't like your opinion is tired and it's irrelevant, and like have a more nuanced discussion of this. But Shehan, as long as we're in a world where the number of teams is set, you know what? Like the way TCU ended, right? This would have been a 2-team year. If this was it, and it's like, oh, what's the playoff? It's like, it's Georgia versus Michigan in the national title game. Who would argue that? TCU, you had your chance. You lost your conference title game. Yes, right. You earned the right to lose that game, but so did Georgia and Michigan, and they won theirs. All right, Ohio State, you lost to Michigan. I don't know what to tell you. Like this probably, there's a line. We're all drawing a line after 2 teams this year. You could go 2. There are times when 6 teams deserve to get in or 5, and now you're leaving out a, quote, deserving team. Probably the line of like truly whatever deserving means might be cut off after TCU this year, right? I mean, Ohio State, it's hard, right? But that's not how we do it. So what, like an amorphous, hey, the playoff is everybody who crosses this threshold. And whether that's a numerical algorithm of like everybody that's over 100 in the ratings, sometimes it's 2. Now it's got to be at least 2. If there's only one team that's over 100, there's no playoff. They're the national champ. Sorry, TV. I'm sure TV would be fine with that, right? If there's 11 teams, all right. Now this is buys. Here's a play-in game, whatever. If there's 17, if there's 5, whatever it is, now that's our deserving thing. But that's not what we do. I would love that because now you're not beholden to anybody else. You're beholden to you showing yourself with your schedule and the way you played against it. You've reached a threshold that means you have a shot at a title. That, of course, would never happen. But that's like you have to have that context. And so I am this team doesn't deserve it, man. I don't know what to tell you. The rule is 4. And I get really tired of that word. And I wasn't this way. I admit I was one of those people once upon a time, but it's okay to evolve. I think it's an unnuanced view of things to really hang your hat on that.
Yeah. And I mean, I get it, right? Like, frankly, I think Michigan's really good. Heading into this playoff, I kind of think the national championship might be a 1-team race. I kind of think that Georgia might just be a lot better than everybody else. But at the same time, this is why we play the games, right? Because now Georgia's going to have an opportunity to play against Michigan, and Michigan's going to have a chance to prove that they can win that game. Ohio State is going to have a chance to prove that they can win that game. Honestly, I'm very excited for this TCU versus Michigan game. I think that this could actually be a really competitive game. A lot of people just think, oh, well, TCU's just like worse Ohio State, but like they're not. They just played one of the most physical teams in America yesterday in Kansas State, and they held up physically. That was not the issue, right? So like, I just think that we have these ideas of what teams are and kind of have a finite view of it and have this idea that there's this objectivity to deserving versus non-deserving versus whatever else. The point isn't to find exactly the line for where the deserving teams are or exactly the line for where teams that can win the national championship are. It's to find the 4 most deserving teams that we can get into the field. And again, like there have been years, like you said, this year, if you had to, I don't think anybody would lose their minds about it, right? Because I think that there are 2 teams that won their conferences that are legitimate national titles contenders. But there are other years like 2014 where, like you said, you have 6. There's a year like 2017 where you have an undefeated UCF who doesn't even get a chance to play for a national title despite going 12-0, right? So like, that's where I think that we're going to be in the best position heading forward, is that I would rather, and I'm curious your perspective on this, I would rather let teams that aren't quote unquote national title deserving into the field, but make sure that we get the teams that are deserving into the field versus be in a position where we say, well, we want to make sure that every single team that gets any chance to play for a national title has to be deserving. Cause like that just seems like a ridiculous bar to me.
No, I once upon a time said things like I'd rather leave a good team out than let a bad team in, and I disagree with that now. I'm very, very much, and I'm very, 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 very strong on the idea of you've got to be able to lose. You can't demand perfection, right? The idea that every year in the NFL, when the last undefeated team loses and the 72 Dolphins celebrate, and it's like, oh, that's of course, because like, of course, nobody would go undefeated in the NFL. And yet somehow that's the expectation for the amateurs, for the amateur teenagers. Like that's, well, if you're not, hey, you lost once, what do you expect? Of course you don't deserve. So, I mean, I do think there's a podcast for us in the off season of let's go through. And if we were having a quote deserving, and maybe we'll come up with a better word than that, a championship level threshold, what to us would have been the ideal number of teams to make it each year. Right. And we can each go through and have our own number. Okay. 2017, how many teams met that threshold? Ooh, 9. Wow. 2019, how many teams met that? Ooh, 3. Interesting, right? I think that's an off-season pod for us. But let's talk about TCU, because you're as qualified to talk about TCU as anybody in the country. Good quarterback who's in the Heisman race. Good quarterback. Number 1 receiver who's an NFL dude. Number 1 running back Donovan Edwards is, my goodness, for Michigan. Oh boy, I think at this point, with the way Donovan Edwards has played the last 2 weeks while carrying the ball in his wrong hand. Again, I was saying this to my daughter. It's like, okay, you've had situations, right? People break their hand. You're right-handed. You break your right hand. Something happens. You have to learn to write left-handed so you can take notes in school. And I said, that's what Donovan Edwards had to do. Imagine you had to learn to write left-handed, but while you were writing, people kept hitting your arm the whole time.
And booing you.
And booing. Like that guy had to learn to carry the ball left-handed. And I'm at the point, I'm like, I think maybe if Blake Corum had remained healthy, he would have won the Heisman. And I also think he might be the second best running back on his own team. Like, this is one of these things again, like, I think he might be the best player in college football and simultaneously the second best running back that Michigan has, because Donovan Edwards, my goodness. But Kendry Miller stacks up with any running back in the playoff, right? And then Sonny Dykes, great coaching job. I'm not going to pretend I'm as much as an expert on the TCU defense, but I think even the idea of, well, Ohio State would be favored over TCU. And it's like, why? Like what? Like only based on recruiting ratings? How good? Give us your TCU breakdown in this moment here. This TCU Michigan game, again, like I love it, and it is not a slam dunk for Michigan, right?
Right. Well, I think that we have to think back to that Ohio State game and how it happened and the way that Michigan took over that game. And a big part of it was coverage busts, right? So TCU secondary is a lot better than Ohio State's. They have a Thorpe Award finalist in Travis Hodges-Tomlinson, and actually their other corner, Josh Newton, is also very good. So I think that their corners are actually a strength of the team. The safeties are probably a little bit more, they're above average players, but they're not elite players. But their corners are very good. So I don't think that we're going to be in a situation where we see guys running 20 yards free against this TCU secondary. Now, again, people are going to remember Deuce Vaughn going crazy on that one big play against TCU. And like, Deuce Vaughn's just really good, man. I don't know what to tell you. Like, Deuce Vaughn's really good. And when he's in the open field, he's going to make a lot of people look silly. But I do think on the back end, they're pretty good. The question's more going to be on the front end. They have a couple of big pieces. I think that I think that they need to show that they can be physical on the interior of the defensive line. That's going to be the big question mark, I think. Not because they don't have the talent, but because they're playing Michigan, who has one of the best offensive lines in the entire country. And, linebacker, they're pretty good. They have a linebacker, Johnny Hodges, who didn't play yesterday, and I think that was a big part of also their struggles as well. So he's actually a little bit more of a Big Ten style linebacker, a physical guy. He transferred from Navy, but not necessarily the fastest guy, but maybe that's a better thing, to be big and physical over kind of a speed defense type player playing against a Michigan team. So I think they stack up pretty well. Again, look, Michigan's really good, and they're gonna get their rushing yards. They just are, right? I mean, regardless of who's carrying the ball, their offensive line is going to give them a chance. And also, we saw JJ McCarthy have some big plays. But by the way, I also think that TCU can kind of do what Purdue did yesterday, but like better, right? I mean, because Purdue stuck around in that game. If they convert red zone trips into touchdowns instead of field goals, like they could have won that game. Michigan did not run away with that game whatsoever. This was not a 2021 42-3 against Iowa. It was nothing like that. And I don't think that Michigan's just going to do what Georgia did to LSU, for example, right? And then offensively, I think a lot of people watch that game. They've got a top 10 NFL draft pick in Quentin Johnston at receiver who's been banged up and was pretty healthy yesterday, but I think will be fully healthy by the time that they play in a month. They've got an All-America caliber running back in Kendre Miller, like you said, who, by the way, is one game away from tying LaDainian Tomlinson's record for most consecutive games with a rushing touchdown. So he finds a way to change games with his legs. He had the game-changing 75-yard touchdown run against Texas that basically clinched the game for TCU. And obviously they've got a quarterback who, look, Max Duggan is not a perfect football player. He is not Caleb Williams from a talent perspective. He's not CJ Stroud from a talent perspective, but he is a gamer. He is just one of those guys who knows where he needs to be, knows where the ball needs to be, knows how to make the right decision, and he is a really dangerous player with his legs. I would expect that to be a huge part of the game plan whenever TCU plays against Michigan, to get him on the outside, to get the Michigan defense moving side to side. I don't think that TCU is just going to say, we're going to try to run it up the middle and cause issues, right? I think that TCU is going to try to attack Michigan's defense in a lot of different directions. And again, people will watch that game against Kansas State yesterday and say, well, TCU's offense had lulls. I mean, Kansas State is also really good defensively. They've got a potential first-round defensive end in Felix Anudike-Uzomah. So I mean, I would say that Michigan should be favored in this game. They have the much lower variance strategy to kind of just run over the top of TCU, but TCU can absolutely compete in this game. I think this is one of the better matchups that, obviously Oklahoma is the only other Big 12 team that has been in the college football playoff to this point. I think this is as favorable a matchup as the Big 12 has ever gotten heading into the playoff. Again, Michigan's a favorite, but TCU will have a chance.
So the early lines are out. I'm going to make you guess them in a second. Don't look anything up. I do think a version of, when you look at Purdue, Michigan, Purdue actually outgained Michigan in that game, which is misleading, but it was 456 to 386 in yards. And again, Purdue was in it until Michigan put it away in the fourth quarter. They were in it. I do think when you look at Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, Devin Mockabee at running back, and Charlie Jones at receiver for Purdue. And again, O'Connell did his thing. He threw for more than 300 yards. Mockabee was 17 carries for 71. And Charlie Jones, who's probably the second best receiver in the Big Ten this year, 13 receptions for 162. They really fed him. But Max Duggan, Kendre Miller, Quentin Johnston, I think is a next level up version of a top three compared to Purdue. And those three offensive guys for Purdue help Purdue stay in that game. So now this is a better version of that with a better defense, right? With a better depth of talent. And Michigan did not destroy that. So I do think that, I don't know. I don't want to just, and they play differently. We understand that, but Purdue is TCU is turbocharged Purdue. I don't think is a terrible analysis. And the real Purdue hung around for a little bit. So let's quickly do a little bit Georgia, Ohio State analysis, because obviously I'm around this Ohio State team. This is the matchup I think that a lot of people in the country wanted last year. That we're getting it now is very interesting. And I do think it's one of those of Georgia, and you and I have like debated this and we've talked about this. We kind of were, early in the year, we did a pod about, is Georgia better than last year? Then Georgia had a couple bumps and it's like, okay, are they better than last year? I don't like their backfield. They replaced those guys, but I think last year's backfield is probably better. I think like Brock Bowers is 1 year older and Ladd McConkey's a real dude, but I think the receivers are maybe similar. I think the defense is whatever 10%, 15% of a step down from a defense that just shoved its whole defense into the NFL from a year ago. So I do think the baseline analysis of Georgia in the end is probably not quite as good as last year's team. And Ohio State's better than last year's Ohio State because their defense got better. And CJ Stroud's a year older. And even though they don't have Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, their receivers, and we do not know what's going to happen with Jackson Smith and Jigba. He basically lost the whole season, but the idea of now you got 3.5 weeks, like, can he be back? I don't know. My guess at the moment is the answer is not no. He's not going to play. I don't think it's that. I definitely think it's not a yes. And I think it's a maybe that, I don't know, pure speculation. Maybe it's a maybe that leans toward no, then closer to yes, but it's still a maybe. So that is a thing that we don't know about. Ohio State's run game will be healthier because they've had Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson who have battled injuries all year. They're not as serious as the Jackson Smith and Jigba injury, but they certainly worked themselves. Against Michigan, Mayan Williams was clearly limited. They tried to play, but he wasn't himself, and Travion Henderson couldn't play. They wound up playing a guy that they brought as a linebacker to be the running back. So that will be better for Ohio State. And everybody's going to be a little bit healthier. But Ohio State, there's some things offensively where, you wonder. And then I do think, like, the internal part of it, Shehan, like, they didn't play their best against Michigan. Well, we always talk about this. We talk about Angry Bama. Angry Bama was my thing in 2020, right? They don't make the playoff for the first time in 2019. And all year they're like, oh, ho, ho, ho. And you have an overdog, the ultimate overdog that you turn into an underdog. Guess what? When Bama got in 17, after being number one all year, they lose. They don't know if they're going to get in. They get in. They win the national championship. Ohio State, they have the Virginia Tech loss in 2014. They're doubted all year. They get in. They win the national championship. These overdogs who actually have factual basis to be an underdog, because they try to fake be underdogs all the time. But it's like Ohio State. It's like, oh, yeah, you lost to Michigan. Everybody was like, well, that's it for your program. Set it on fire. You're out of the playoff. And it's like, oh, no, you're back. Like, motivational stuff matters. And they're going to have the motivational stuff where Georgia's like, hey, Georgia, you're awesome. Good luck trying to meet the status quo. What, like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that means Ohio State is going to beat Georgia, but I don't know. This is about the biggest, like, rising up back from the dead kind of thing. Who's the wrestler? My God, that wrestler's meme.
The Undertaker. It's the Undertaker.
Can we get another meme?
That's like the only one I know. I don't know any of the others. I know, like, John Cena, the Undertaker, that's Hulk Hogan. I don't know. Like, Hulk Hogan. That's where
Iron
we're at.
Sheik. I was really into the Iron Sheik. I can remember, like, Sergeant Slaughter. Oh, I was really into Sergeant Slaughter. Everybody was. And then, like, I got to know James Laurinaitis, obviously, when he played at Ohio State. And I've continued to know James, and he's a really good guy. And his dad obviously was a professional wrestler. And when James was a player, I did a story one time about him. I went to his family's house in Minnesota and hung out. And he was like, oh, yeah, Sergeant Slaughter, like, used to come over for Thanksgiving. And I was like, what? Sergeant Slaughter came over for like, what a life. Sergeant Slaughter. So anyway, that world of, like, you're the back from the dead team that everybody thought was done, I mean, is a thing. And then also you're talented. Overdogs as underdogs is like a real thing. So Ohio State's going to get to play that. And then again, Georgia's secondary, I think, is pretty darn good. There's some real dudes in that secondary, right? So Ohio State, I do think, is going to have to throw to win. I do think there are some similarities, maybe between Michigan and Georgia, but you take away all the stuff. Whatever, like, and even Ryan Day, the way he's been talking a little bit of, like, we were tight, we played tight, that I think in the end, they did not. And I thought it when that game ended, that they didn't handle the intangibles of trying to get revenge on Michigan. I thought they did not handle it as well as you maybe thought they would. So now you've taken all those negative intangibles away, and you're applying only positive intangibles because you have an opportunity you never thought you were going to have. Meanwhile, Georgia's trying to defend something, and defending's harder than getting, because there's just a different motivation there. Georgia's the best team in college football, and maybe Shehan is about to embark on a dynasty. We've talked about that, right? Might be early Saban, what Kirby's doing right now. But interesting matchup, and I think Ohio State has a chance, right? They definitely have a chance.
Yeah, well, I'll say two things. One, Do you know how many yards that LSU threw for last night? Do you know how many yards they threw for?
96.
502 yards.
Oh my, that's a lot. Oh,
they threw for 502 yards and outgained Georgia. Now I will mention Georgia went up 35-7. So like the game was kind of over in the first half, right? Like, so I will say that. But 500 yards is 500 yards, and LSU ain't walking Marvin Harrison Jr. through the door, right? Like, Kayshon Boutte is an NFL receiver, but, you know, I think that he's been a little underwhelming. And so, I think that this Georgia team is still very good defensively. They haven't played very many teams that can both throw over the top of them and also like cause them enough issues defensively to make things interesting, right? Because I think you look at Tennessee, and Tennessee, by the way, that was a 27-13 game. Like, yes, it was a blowout on the field, but like it was like one or two plays away from switching too, right? And I will say Tennessee plays a one read predictable offensive system that relies on athletes to create space. That's not what Ohio State's going to come in with. They're going to come in with guys who can win one-on-one matchups consistently, that can be schemed open as well. And so I think it's a little bit of a different situation than when you look at that situation like Tennessee. I mean, again, as somebody who covered the old Baylor offense for several years, it just works differently than just having a bunch of good receivers who can run great routes, right? And so I think that the big question for this game is going to come down to whether Ohio State can run the ball at all. I know that that's been the thing all year, right? But like, can they move the chains? Can they stay on schedule? Because I think that when you look at Georgia, and I'll toss into this, we just assume that Georgia is going to be Alabama, but Alabama is Alabama, right? Like there's one team in the history of college football that's ever been like that. And I think that Georgia is a dominant team this year. I think they're going to win the national championship. I think that they'll beat both Ohio State and whoever wins the next game to win the national title again. But like, this is not just 2012 Bama, right? Like this, I think that we can't just assume that because we saw Bama do it for so long. And so Georgia is a team that dominates games by staying on schedule. They get up early. They, in this game, by the way, LSU drove all the way down the field and had a very makeable field goal that was blocked and returned for a touchdown. And that set them behind schedule. And that was kind of the game right there. Georgia went on and pulled away from there. So I think that's going to be the big question. Can Ohio State jump out early, get Georgia off schedule, and also just find ways to control the ball physically? Can they compete with Georgia's front? Certainly, I think that we'd hope that Travion Henderson is able to come back and add a little bit of a dynamic component in the run game. Obviously, he didn't play against Michigan. I think that would be a pretty significant addition. But this Georgia team, again, I think is the best in the country. But I'm trying to think, this is the worst, quote unquote, best team in the country since.
We're constantly on the search for super teams now because the world has done that to us. But you think about Georgia last year with a defense that's as good as we had seen, right? You think about Angry Bama in 2020. 9
first-round picks or whatever.
That Bama team that is just stacked in 2020. Right. You think about, obviously, the LSU talent in 2019. I guess it's 2018 with Clemson where you win a national championship with a true freshman quarterback, I guess. But certainly we're now on the search for super teams.
But like, remember that defensive line too, right? Like that was 4 or 3 first-round picks in the on that defensive line. And like, yeah, I think that they're probably the closest. But I mean, that's where we're at, right? It's saying like, well, maybe it's the worst since Trevor Lawrence, right? Like that's where we're at. And I think even you look back at some of the teams before that, right? Like the Alabama Georgia 2017 game would probably be the last like not complete super team game. Like this is probably the quote unquote worst super team in 4 or 5 years. And that makes them, I think, beatable. They're the favorites. They're the favorites to win the title. They should be. But I mean, I would not look at what Georgia has done all season and say they're obviously going to run through everybody else, because this is the same Georgia team that needed a comeback against Missouri. This is the same Georgia team that kind of only put Tennessee away because Tennessee couldn't hit a big play. This was the same Georgia team that allowed LSU to throw for 500 yards, which with much worse players than really are playing in this playoff, that played Kentucky to only 16-6, that let Georgia Tech hang around at halftime, right? So this is the best team in the country, but they are not infallible. And I think that makes this one of the most intriguing playoffs in a while.
When we come back, we'll talk about the betting lines for this game. We'll talk about the teams that are kicking themselves about not making the playoff. We'll do a little bit on the 12-teamer next. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. All right, I'll make you guess. I hope you haven't looked. What do you guess the line for Georgia Ohio State is?
I'm going to guess something like Georgia -4.
So I've seen it at 6.5 and I've seen it at 7. So my instinct on that game is Ohio State with the points. What's your instinct at first blush?
I think that I would for sure take the points on 7. I think it's going to be about a 7-point game. So I think that's about right. So I would lean towards taking the points, though.
What do you think the betting line is in the Fiesta Bowl for TCU Michigan?
I'm sure it's huge. I'm going to guess like 11.
9.5 or so. So I'm inclined to take TCU and the points there at first blush as well.
I think so too.
So those realities, we only have like another, 3 weeks to get into all this stuff, and we certainly will. The idea that Boo Corrigan said they did not discuss, it did not come up, avoiding an Ohio State-Michigan rematch in a semifinal. It would have come up in my head if I was one of the 13 people. And I do think there's enough similarities to a year ago with Alabama-Georgia, but last year with Alabama-Georgia, and not wanting to have them face off again in a semifinal, Alabama beats Georgia. Alabama's got to be 1 because now you're out of undefeated teams. And then Georgia's not going to be 4 because Cincinnati was going to be 4 no matter what. So you wound up with Georgia was 3, Michigan was 2. It didn't matter who 2 and 3 was, but there weren't a lot of mental gymnastics to avoid an Alabama-Georgia rematch in a semifinal last year because it was obvious. I think this is kind of obvious. I do think TCU should be ahead of Ohio State. But if I was in the room, I would have said, hey, by the way, everybody, unless you have an incredibly powerful, no doubt about it reason why Ohio State should be ahead of TCU, let's not have them play in a semifinal because duh. So the idea of even on the ESPN show, they were like, they shouldn't think about that. It should only, yes, of course you should think about it. Live in the world. Right? I don't think that would have been the best thing. I don't think. Now, if you get a national title game, okay, let's go. Two Big Ten teams playing for the national title in Big Ten country. There's something that just feels natural about that, right? It's a joke about LA being Big Ten country. But I think you should have thought about it. So in the end, right, do you think anybody wanted Ohio State, Michigan in a semifinal? I certainly did not.
I don't think so. And I do believe Boo Corrigan that 1, it was either not brought up, or 2, if it was brought up, it was kind of shied away. I mean, sitting in that room on the mock committee, Bill Hancock and Boo Corrigan were perfectly happy to say this is irrelevant. Don't talk about it, basically. And when we talked about Vegas odds. And so I do think that this was not a true topic of conversation in the room, but everybody who's voting knows it. Everybody who's voting knows, hey, by the way, if I'm putting Ohio State 3 and TCU 4, then it's a rematch that really doesn't need to happen for anyone's sake and doesn't even have an especially compelling reason to rematch, right? If Georgia loses that game and Michigan is the 1 seed, then maybe it changes the calculus, and we can have that conversation about that might be silly, but at the same time, it's kind of human nature. It's kind of logical. It's kind of just the right thing to do, unless there's a really compelling reason, like you said, to have these teams slotted exactly there. The seeding doesn't matter all that much.
Yeah, it's just it's just jerseys. Unless you're trying to avoid a game you don't want to play at this point. So this idea of who else could have been here. This was a topic on Saturday night when people saw the way Clemson played once DJ Uiagalelei got benched and Cade Klubnik came in for Clemson and helped lead Clemson past North Carolina. Because Clemson had absorbed a second loss to South Carolina in the last game of the regular season, on the list, there was a huge thing, right, of Ohio State fans thanking Kyle Whittingham. for beating USC and getting Ohio State in the playoff. I think Shane Beamer maybe should even be ahead of Kyle Whittingham, because Shane Beamer in South Carolina
He did it twice.
Took out Tennessee and Clemson. And if that wouldn't have happened, I think one loss Clemson as an ACC champ is ahead of Ohio State. And I think one loss Tennessee as a non-champ might be ahead of Ohio State. He took out 2 teams for Ohio State. But the idea that Dabo did not get to Cade Klubnik sooner, a lot of people were saying like that cost them a playoff spot. And then I saw you making very interesting arguments, kind of pushing back against that idea. We talked about this from the jump. It's why I picked Clemson to make the playoff this year, because I thought the defense will be good. And I think they'll have 2 options for quarterback to be better. Either DJ will be better or he won't be, and they'll go to Cade Klubnik. And they wound up right in the middle. That DJ was better than last year, but he still wasn't good enough really for them to be the best of who they could be. And they didn't get to Cade Klubnik until it was too late. Did Dabo blow it? Did he blow it by not getting to a true freshman earlier in the year that would have allowed them? Maybe it doesn't beat Notre Dame, but then maybe it beats South Carolina, and Clemson's the number 4 seed right now.
So couple things. First of all, I think that Cade Klubnik beats South Carolina. I do. The second thing, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, I don't think that Cade Klubnik makes any difference in the Notre Dame game. I think that was a total curb stomping, and that would have happened regardless. Would you agree with that?
I think it's minimal, right? Maybe it's an extra touchdown, but I don't think it changes the fabric of how the game felt. I agree with that.
Yeah, and so you're assuming a loss there. And so the point that I was making is, I think that when we think about the idea of inserting Klubnik, and like maybe you insert Klubnik against Notre Dame and he figures it out, and therefore he's like able to go and be good against South Carolina. But you would have had to play it perfectly in my mind for this to make sense, because I think people are forgetting the first half of the season because DJ struggled in some big moments for Clemson down the stretch, because DJ was really good early in the season. The games that I pointed at, and I'm trying to find the stats. I pulled up the stats. DJ against, I think it was NC State, Wake Forest, it was Louisville, and Florida State. 10 touchdowns, no interceptions, completed 67% of his passes, and rushed for, I think, 4 more touchdowns. Like, I'm just not assuming that Cade Klubnik, in his first starts of his career, plays as well as DJ did in those games. He played really well in those games. He was a huge part of the reason that they won close games. And so I think that, yes, the South Carolina game flips if Cade Klubnik's the starter, but they do not sweep those 4 games, in my mind, if Cade Klubnik is the starter, because those are some really good teams. I mean, remember that Wake Forest game? Remember how good DJ was in that game in overtime? I think it went to 3 overtimes and was 51-45. Like,
toe for toe with Sam Hartman. Yep.
Right. Cade Klubnik blinks at some point and they lose that game. They just do, right? Like, that was one of the best quarterback battles of the entire season. Now, I also wasn't writing glowing pieces about DJ being all of a sudden a star now because he played well against Wake Forest's defense. But I think that we love to think of the idea of, well, in this one spot, things would have changed, and not think about all these other spots might have changed too. And
for the worse, right.
Right. And so if Dabo handles that situation, Trevor Lawrence perfectly, which he has done before, then maybe that happens. And maybe if the change happens at halftime of the South Carolina game or before the South Carolina game, then Clemson is able to thread a needle and make the playoff. But I think that we're assuming it as, oh, well, if Cade was starting, then Clemson would have simply gone 12-0. And I mean, Clemson did not beat most of its ACC competition convincingly. And so I just think that that's a silly way to think.
This was not a no doubt about it playoff team undone only by quarterback play.
Right. And the wide receiver play is not good. Their wide receivers might have fallen off more than their quarterbacks over the past couple of years. And I think that that's a huge part of their issues. And they're a really good defense, but they are not the killers that they were a couple years ago either.
I don't know that is a catastrophic failure, but there was an opportunity, I think, as you put it, to thread the needle that they didn't do. And so is there a world where Clemson makes the playoff? Yeah. there is. Is it like how did they blow it? I don't think it's how did they blow it, but Dabo, who again, sometimes like we talk, I love the ruthlessness discussion of when you make a difficult decision that's best for the team. And it's no more exemplified than what Nick Saban did at halftime of a national championship game and won his team a national title. Like that idea, I think the idea of you do it at halftime of South Carolina, right? And like EJJ, we love you, but like, it's just not it, man. This is a huge game. We got to do it. Like that maybe is the opportunity where you would have gotten the best of both worlds. The veteran guy kind of gets you through, you get the best of him, but like as soon as it's not there, you don't give him the benefit of the doubt anymore and you go. And there's a ruthlessness to that. And I don't know, right? He was ruthless, right? He got to Trevor Lawrence pretty quick after Kelly Bryant had made them the number 1 seed in the playoff the year before. And then Kelly Bryant transferred like soon after. And so he has been at that times. It's a tough decision. So in the end, I don't think it's that Dabo blew it, but he didn't maybe seize the opportunity that was there. Tennessee, just the idea like South Carolina blew them off the field and Hooker gets hurt, just a worst of all possible worlds that opened the door for the Big Ten to get into. That's a tough one. And then obviously what happened with USC. And again, you can go back. There have been good points made. John Wilner brought this up that like Washington lost to
Arizona State. That's the weirdest result of the season. I have no idea what happened.
And if they don't lose that game, then they are only a 1-loss Pac-12 team. Right. That now it's USC versus Washington in a world where the winner is going to be a 1-loss Pac-12 champ. And that team is going to be in regardless. So like you can go through and say there's probably 5 or 6 things that happened for Ohio State, even before Ohio State knew that they needed the help, that got them to this point where they have a chance to get in as a 1-loss non-champ. But when you look around, they're the best option. They are. But there's about 5 or 6 other teams that with one more win would have been that best option. And then all the deserve gang, the deserve gang would have been like riding into town. Hey, it's the deserve gang. They're making sure that everybody in the playoff actually deserves to be there, or they're going to have a rootin' tootin' shootout at the town square. Like the deserve gang would have been all fired up and happy because that team would have deserved it. But those teams fell by the wayside along the way, which got us to this point.
And I did find the stats. So in the 4 games, again, Wake Forest, NC State, Louisville, Florida State, 4 very good teams that beat a lot of good teams along the way. DJ completed 67% of his passes for 968 yards, rushed for 194 yards, had 14 total touchdowns with 0 interceptions in 4 games. That's really good. That's really, really, really good. And the idea that a freshman would have been able to do that, no doubt about it. I mean, I just don't see that whatsoever.
So we are going to be having a Heisman discussion on our Apple podcast show this week as the Apple show, because right now I'm a Heisman voter and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I literally have no idea. And I'm going to go back and I'm not going to have an idea until I reset myself, because I have to reset because nothing happened as you expected. Nobody stepped up and said, that's it. I'm claiming it and it makes it easy. And so I'm going to have to reset, and we're going to have that discussion. We do an extra show each week. It's a bonus episode for Apple Podcast subscribers, $2.99 a month, 75 cents an episode. You get those 4 episodes every month. All the way through this month of December, we're going to have the regular episode where we welcome all of you each week, and we're so happy to have you. But if you want a little bit more, that's where you get out in the Apple Podcast episode. Subscribe to us on Apple. Pay that $2.99 a month to get the extra show. 12-teamer, Shehan. I'm dumb, and I had not thought about this as much in the 12-team discussion, but the idea of all these underdog teams, and because we had not, I am going to have to go back and look. We have not had a rash of underdogs winning conference championship games in the playoff era, but the idea that Kansas State and Utah would be in the playoff right now, that like they weren't going to get wild card bids, but they would have won their way in. If you think right now what a 12, and again, the top 4 seeds have to be conference champs. So not only would Kansas State be in, Kansas State would get a bye.
They'd be the 3 seed.
This is what we'd be looking at right now. Pretty certainly, right? Georgia 1, Michigan 2, Kansas State 3, Clemson 4 as your top 4 seeds because they are conference champs. Then you'd be looking at 5-12, TCU Tulane, 6-11, Ohio State USC, 7-10, Alabama Penn State, 8, 9, Tennessee, Utah. That might adjust a little bit because we're doing this before they put out the final official top 25. That idea, right? It's good. It's great that Utah got a Rose Bowl berth and that Kansas State's going to get a New Year's Six Bowl because they won those games. But right? You're upsetting your way into now you have a shot to win the national championship because you beat TCU in overtime. And TCU, right? The idea that I think we're going to enter a world with a 12 team where their losses aren't as punitive. Right? It's not like, well, you lost. Sorry. You ruined your whole season with one loss. But the wins can be even greater. The wins, I don't think, lose anything. And I think the wins possibly gain something all along the way. South Carolina, right? South Carolina would still celebrate beating Tennessee and Clemson, even though Tennessee and Clemson still made the playoff. South Carolina wouldn't be like, oh, what was the point of even beating those guys? They still made the playoff. We should have just lost to them. Who cares? Spencer Rattler's still smoking 2 cigars, baby. He's loving it. But Clemson and Tennessee don't have to be like, oh my God, those games killed us and now we're done, right? But this idea, Kansas State and Utah in the playoff, it makes me here for the 12-teamer even more because it would have been interesting. We're going to get some interesting first-round games if we had a 12-teamer this year. But also, Yahoo! Deuce Vaughn, Cam Rising, Dalton Kincaid. Let's get him in the playoff. Cade Klubnik now starting a playoff game. Let's go. I'm here for it.
The funny thing about this, right, is that yesterday you're looking at TCU, and TCU loses because they fall literally an inch short on the goal line in overtime, right? Also, by the way, that game had no relevance for what was going to happen to them afterwards. So obviously, that must mean that the players didn't care, right? Because nothing changed. Literally nothing changed about their situation because of that game. Except for that Max Duggan was over there crying at the podium actively, like while he's trying to answer questions because guys want to win football games.
Yes,
there's this idea that these guys who, by the way, spent every day of their life training for this moment, this game, for a chance to hold a trophy against your conference, that suddenly they won't care. Like, come on. Have you ever met an athlete? Have you ever seen a football team play? It's just completely inconsistent with the facts. Because like you said, ultimately, this game did not cost TCU anything except for the chance to win their conference in a 12-game playoff, a conference championship, a game that matters, a game that should matter, a game that every single season should start with thinking about. Will have made the difference between Kansas State getting a bye and TCU having to play a much tougher path. And I think that we also have this idea that, well, the team's going to make the playoff anyway, so who cares? So like, why would they care about how it happens? I mean, having to play an extra playoff game is a huge deal. Having to play, like, for example, I think that, there were some that I looked at that was like, Alabama would have to first play like Kansas State or Utah or something like that in the first round. And then they'd have to, it's like this
Penn
makes
State,
it,
yeah.
Right. That sucks. I wouldn't want to play Penn State before having to even play the other teams that finished in the top 4 and also be worn down by that first game before getting to play any of the top 4 teams and then having to beat all of them basically on the way to a championship. That sounds really freaking hard. And I think that we lose sight of that, right? And the idea that there's no stakes involved or that nobody's going to care just completely misses what college football is and why people want to play sports in the first place.
Yeah, the idea that like Alabama's path getting it would be Penn State, then potentially Michigan in round 2, then
Yikes.
Either Kansas State or Ohio State in round 3, and then Georgia in the national title game. And then be like, all right, well then people be like, I can't believe Bama got in. It's like, well, did you see the teams they beat? They kind of earned it, right? So, that's like, in the end, whatever deserve means to the middle-aged men of America who are angry about the 20-year-olds who didn't deserve this.
Right.
When you get to the 12-team world, the team that wins it is gonna deserve it because
right.
if you're gonna have played 3 or 4 bangers, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. So, but I think in the end, but this 4-teamer is right. Is where we started. This 4-teamer is right.
And by the way, I think that we are completely discounting an idea that I think is going to be great for college football and for the playoff, which is traditional powers that we thought were good losing games, because Alabama this year, I think anybody who's not living in Tuscaloosa right at this second can acknowledge this Alabama team isn't all that great, right? Like, they played Texas A&M within 4 points. They played Texas within 1 point. It's not the best version of Alabama. So what's better? The committee saying we don't think you're that good, or Alabama playing a game that, by the way, they can't say, oh, we weren't trying, it didn't matter. Alabama going and losing to Kansas State and getting knocked out of the playoff, right? Like, how crazy would that be? And how much would that change the way that we think about college football, right? Like, Ohio State right now, they get in as the 4 seed. They're going to play number 1 Georgia this year. And like, again, we had this conversation. I think that Ohio State can be competitive and maybe win that game. But also there's a scenario where Ohio State gets run off the field. And how much would that change the way that we look at not just Ohio State this year, but Ohio State in terms of, well, they have all those great players, but does it matter if you don't do it, right? I think that changes things completely.
And there's also the opportunity for the Blue Bloods to do the opposite, which is all the times that people say, oh my God, like 6 SEC teams would win the Big 12. If Bama like backs in, right? Oh, this Bama team's not very good. And then Bama like rolls 4 top 6 teams on the way to the national title. It's like, oh yeah, no, oh, they were right. Like, right. So that, but you get your chance. You get your chance either way to prove it on the field. So this is the second last year of the 4-team playoff. Little consternation, but in the end, this is right. I think this is right. And we have one more year of this, and then we're going to get to 12 teams. So we have a lot coming. We'll have this Heisman conversation for Apple Podcast listeners. We're going to break down both semifinals. We'll make sure we make our picks before we get to this. We have a lot of fun stuff coming on the College Football Survivor Show. This is a playoff show, and the playoff is here. We appreciate you guys making it part of your week. Make sure you're reading Shehan at cbssports.com. But for now, for Shehan Jeyarajah, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the College Football Survivor Show. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.